So Craig Nevill-Manning from Google.
Yep.
So what's your background, Craig?
I did a PhD in computer science here in New Zealand at Waikato University, and then I went to the US basically as an academic, and then decided that Google was a pretty interesting opportunity, so I jumped into industry, which has been a lot of fun.
When did you join Google?
Back in late 2000s, so about 8 years ago. I was out in New York and heard about this fantastic opportunity. I started using Google as one of the early users and realized that they were really onto something. So my wife and I moved out to California and started with Google. And a couple of years later, we desperately wanted to move back to New York. So we got to start up the software engineering office for Google in New York City.
So what is exactly is a software office in New York for Google? What are we talking about, order of magnitude?
We've got about 800 software engineers there, about 2,000 staff in total, and we're working on all kinds of products. We built Google Maps initially, which has expanded now. We have people working on that around the world, but that started in New York. We've got a lot of people working on the ad side of things, all the way through to the deep sort of infrastructure that is behind Google. So we've got engineers sort of from really all kinds of expertise working on sort of the next thing at Google.
So what is Google like as an organization to work in for yourself?
It's Google's pretty large now. It's about 20,000 people, but it still feels a lot like a small company. We try to keep things very informal. We have a very flat management structure, and the culture is very innovative. We want to try and keep that energy that we had as a small company, and encourage people to come up with new ideas constantly. And so it's a pretty fun environment to work in.
So were you always destined to live in the US? Was that always a dream of yours?
Well, when you're in computer science, that's really where things are happening around the world, especially in Silicon Valley, where Google is based. So even when I was in New Zealand, I looked to the kind of interesting developments that were happening there. But we've managed to hire a number of really terrific New Zealanders to work at Google as part of the software engineering team. So Google has made a lot of use of software engineering talent from New Zealand. We really have a terrific education system. We also have a great culture of kind of building things, about getting things done, which really matches well with Google's approach.
So you think Kiwis plug into the US culture and the technology culture over at the centre of the world really well?
I think so. New Zealanders, there's kind of the number 8 wire approach to things, which meshes well with Silicon Valley, where Silicon Valley is very entrepreneurial, but it's really about ideas are important, but putting those ideas into practice is really where the rubber meets the road. And New Zealanders really are very practical.
So what are the big challenges and opportunities facing the industry, you think?
Well, obviously the worldwide economy is in a pretty precarious state right now. At Google, we're being much more careful about our expenditures, but we're putting just as much effort as we always have into developing new ideas, because that's really what will bring us out of this in the end. There'll be a lot of restructuring, but in the end it's innovation that'll drive the worldwide economy, the US and the New Zealand economy back into positive territory.
So what's the opportunity for Kiwi software and tech companies? I mean, should they be based in the US? Should they have an office there, or should they just be more globally aware?
I think understanding what's going on in the US and having connections into the US is really important, because I think one of the things that makes Silicon Valley work really well and the US as a tech center is that ferment of ideas, people meeting from different companies, people moving between companies over time. And I think if you're not in that environment, that you can miss out a little bit. On the other hand, we have an advantage, I think, in New Zealand that we can get a little bit of peace and quiet and work on some really interesting ideas. And software is something where I think the tyranny of distance has less of an impact. You can export a piece of software from New Zealand just as easily as somebody already in the US, and so we should take advantage of the fact that our distance is in some sense not such a disadvantage.
You do need a lot of peace and quiet to write a lot of software too, right?
I think there are studies that show that if you keep getting interrupted, you're less productive over time. And I think in New Zealand, being slightly time shifted and a little bit away from those distractions means that New Zealand software companies can be particularly productive. We're also, New Zealand being a small country in some ways has advantages. Software companies can experiment with the New Zealand scale of things, and then once they get a winning product that's used throughout New Zealand, they can scale that up to a worldwide scale.
So I've got a few small software companies, and we're definitely in New Zealand, I think, trying to promote the space and get our entrepreneurs more prepared for hitting the world stage.
Right.
Well, what do you think the gap is right now for Kiwi entrepreneurs and software companies to making it in the world?
That's a good question. I think it's spending time with entrepreneurs who are for example, in Silicon Valley, with close relationships with venture capital, for example. So there's a risk-taking nature with venture capital backing that I don't see as much in New Zealand. I think traditionally we like to be a little bit more conservative, fund our own companies and grow relatively slowly. That's sometimes a good idea. Sometimes it fails to capture the market potential, and I think that's somewhere where software companies in New Zealand can go, to be a little bit more aggressive, a little bit more ambitious, take some risks, share some equity with investors, but get that multiplying effect that you need to scale up.
What are any software companies that would come to mind from you that actually stand out in New Zealand that are doing a good job of it?
I was just meeting with Orion Health yesterday, which I believe is New Zealand's biggest software export, and they're on the threshold, I think, of a really interesting opportunity where in the US, the Obama administration is pouring a lot of effort into health records and better use of software throughout the health system. So there's a huge potential there. And they've got a bunch of really smart engineers who have some very interesting ideas, some great products already. And so I think there's a huge potential.
Are you pretty excited about the future of New Zealand and our role in the global economy?
I am absolutely. I see New Zealand doing all the right things about having a more global perspective. We're great travelers as New Zealanders, and so I think New Zealanders are much more aware of the world than, say, the average American is, and I think that's an advantage. Some of the disadvantages are being accounted for, putting a lot of attention into broadband. I think that will pay off in the closeness that people in New Zealand feel with people and companies around the world, and that's going to have a huge payoff over the next decade.
Really good to meet you because you've got a lot to offer, I think, the industry and myself included.
Nice to meet you.
Thanks a lot. Cheers, Craig.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thanks, mate.